Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth presentation of our review of the Soul Foundation. It's very important for us to understand that we need to educate ourselves. We need to educate ourselves concerning the possibilities of non-human intelligence, to understand that there's a larger scope to the world. So please, hope that you'll enjoy our presentation this evening. I also want to encourage you to realize that we have our two previous sessions also on our website, just by going to Topical Conversation Archives. That'll present the last two Sunday evening presentations. But tonight we're ready for just a brief introduction by John and then additional questions. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to you, John. And we're so grateful for the work you have put in and your willingness to share. John?
Well, thank you, Vince, and thank you everyone for being here and, really sticking with this. I know that this is a lot of information and some of it may be very new to all of you. And, I'm mindful of that. And so I just want you to know I do appreciate those of you that have hung in there and have revisited the information. One thing I do want to mention, and I thought about doing this a couple different ways, but I think it's just the best way to do this. I've gotten several people sort of informally asking about resources, whether it's about videos or books or whatever, and I have a lot of that stuff. I'm just about done with a resource page that's going to have some materials that I think would be helpful to people wherever you are in this journey. Whether you're at the very beginning or maybe you've been in it for a while and you're just interested in maybe taking it to another step. I have lots of stuff and stuff that I think is really important and relevant to this. So I have that, and I put my email in the chat box for anybody that wants to get in touch with me. I'd be happy to share this information with you. I was going to try and put it up on the screen, and I just thought that might get a little clunky. So, if you want it, if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to me and I'll get that to you within a week or so. So I just wanted to mention that. But again, I'm delighted to be here. And this evening is, as I see it, Vince, is about answering questions for the most part, maybe engaging in some group inquiry. But, it was quite a journey. The Soul Foundation conference was quite a journey, as I've said before, and we've come through a lot. So I'd like to just, turn it back to you, Vince, and open the floor for questions, thoughts, and understanding that a lot of this is speculative. A lot of it is, so it's okay to speculate because it's a mystery. So with that, Vince, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thank you, John. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'll simply moderate this by way of asking people, to give their questions and so on. I will mute myself, so I'll reduce any kind of feedback and so on. So let me just begin by asking any questions that you would like to bring up. And I personally have several myself, but let's first of all go to all of you. Any questions that are on your mind that you would like to bring up? Renee first, and then John.
Yes, thank you, John, very much. I noticed you mentioned in the last one that this is a people from all walks of expertise, science, religion, all areas. I'm curious about those folks in philosophy and religion, if they feel that maybe these beings are, they are spiritual beings, I would think, and they were all created by the same creator. That's what I would, that maybe some forms of life here, when they travel to different realms, have maybe transformed. I don't know. That was a thought that maybe some of these other beings are really related in some fashion to us, but maybe advanced to a
Yeah.
higher degree. And
Renee, I think you're hitting on one of the biggest questions there is in this realm. And that's why I think it was important to the folks at the Soul Foundation, not just in the past, but continuing to bring in as many areas of expertise around this as possible, because the answer is unknown. I think, and I think many people think along those lines, that there is definitely a spiritual component to this, maybe in ways that we don't even understand. But it seems, just based on the anecdotal evidence and the experiences that people have, that there is a spiritual component to it. And that comes even to a recent event. One of the most recent significant, let's say a whistleblower that has come forward. His name is Jake Barber. And he's a military guy, and he was involved in this from the aspect of retrievals, from sort of a nuts and bolts perspective. And, he's been very candid in some of his interviews that when he was in communication with these, it wasn't communication, let's say it was telepathic, like a telepathic communication. He felt a deep sense of spirituality. Now, he doesn't understand it. He's not attempting to understand it, but he's just indicating that this is definitely something, in his view, that is higher dimensional. And you see that a lot in the experiences that people have, that there is a spiritual component to this. There are people who think that this is very analogous to the idea of, and I hate to use old-fashioned terminology, but like angels and demons, messengers from the spiritual world. So, at the end of the day, we don't know. And that is why they brought in all these different folks from all these different disciplines to look at it from all those different perspectives. And I think you're onto something there, that it definitely has that feel to it. And I have that feel to it. But at this point, nobody's really sure what it's all about. So I think you're exactly right to feel that way. And I would encourage you to keep thinking that way. But we just don't have the answer to that yet. But I agree with you. I'll tell you one thing. This is kind of a side note, but I think it's important. One of the biggest questions about this has been, if there is tomorrow, let's say, if there would be an announcement from, kind of like the vision that we all have, the White House, the president comes out and says, look, we've been in contact. There are extraterrestrial beings. That would be big. But we haven't had that yet. But what we have had is some really interesting comments from places like the Vatican. There have been statements from Pope Francis. There have been statements from people that work for Pope Francis, that this is not out of the realm of consideration for the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not advocating for the Catholic Church per se, but I'm just saying they're grappling with this. They're at least trying to come to terms with this. That this may be part of the greater story. Pope Francis said something along the lines a couple years ago, and I'm gonna misquote him, but he said something along the lines of, when he was asked about this, what do you think about the possibility of extraterrestrial life? And he said something like, who are we to judge what God is capable of? And I think that's very telling, and especially considering the Catholic Church many hundreds of years ago had a very staunch position on this. So they've come a long way, and I think other faiths are going to have to grapple with this in some way or another, and some of them already are. And I know that was a long way to answer your question, and I hope it touches on answering your question.
I'd like to weigh in on this just for a moment. Whenever you talk about some kind of spiritual component, we always have to remember there are two aspects to each human being and two aspects to all other, let's say, non-human intelligence. There is the form that particular human being or non-human intelligence takes. So we have forms of bodies, but we have to remember that from a spiritual standpoint, we are certainly not our bodies, nor are other, let's say, non-humans, their bodies. Not that they don't have bodies, not that we don't have bodies, but the essence of who we are is really our individuated eternal soul spirits. I was doing some work with Rudolf Steiner again today, and I was very happy to say that over 100 years ago, he was saying, oh yes, the most important aspect of esoteric knowledge is that we are soul spirits. So it's a very important thing for us when we talk about spirituality to distinguish the form that the soul spirit might take, which is going to be individual, as opposed to a much more universal spiritual awareness. Now, it doesn't mean that every form that a soul spirit might take is going to be friendly, just as there's a lot of people in human life that are not very friendly. So it's a very important thing for us to be able to separate and not get lost in the form. The form is one thing, but the higher dimensional, non-physical, spiritual experience of soul spirit is quite another. That's just very important for us to understand. Leanne, did you want to weigh in on this? Or
Yeah, I did. I wanted to kind of go in that off of Renee there because that was my, it's not really a question, but that's probably my biggest contemplation with this topic is I think of all the historical religious, stories, the visions, all the things out of the Bible or even, throughout time in all religions. That's my contemplation is were those higher intelligences that now we're coming to find are potentially these UAPs, right? Right? Like, Moses on the mountaintop or, so many stories that we've had a certain understanding around. I contemplate of, okay, like you were saying, Renee, like angels and, demons, all these things. But it's what we've kind of built our social structure on, right? And so that's right. There's no question. That's just where so much of my contemplation goes. And it really makes me understand on a deep level how that will affect the fabric of who we believe we are as human beings, right? And as a society and humankind to have that altered. So that it's these conversations we've been having over the last few weeks has really made me kind of look at that. And that's mind-bending to me.
John, do you want to take a shot at that first? I want to take a shot at it as well. And then John Hoops will come back to you. I presume you have maybe a different question, John. So let's take this area first. John Shartle, would you like to make a comment on Leanne's comment? And I'd like to weigh in on it as well. Unmute, John.
Having a conversation with myself.
We've all done it.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Leanne. I think you're right. This is, we're touching on the fabric of what we know. And, I think there are many ways of dealing with this. It's kind of, what do you feel? How do you feel about this? And I think that tells you a lot if you're dialed in. But, even on a sort of an external level, you have people like, I know we've talked about her, but like Diana Walsh-Pasulka, her whole, before she got involved with this topic, she was a scholar of Catholicism. And, particularly studying, Catholic saints who had transcendent experiences like Teresa of Avila. And even in her work, she's starting to sort of reconsider, like, well, were those, experiences that many of the saints in the Catholic Church had, were they some kind of, as Leanne said, message or messenger being visited upon these people. And again, we don't know the answer to that, but it sure sort of lines up with what I feel is happening in many ways now. These sort of, this idea of, entities from beyond coming in and transmitting information to human beings for the betterment of mankind. That's kind of a thematic thing, and it seems very consistent with that, and it's exciting, and it is transformative, and that's really my response to that. I agree, and Vince, I would welcome your comments as well.
Yes, my comments on it. First of all, thank you for the question, Leanne. Thank you, John, for your response. I think a couple comments are in order here. The first one is that nowadays we have a lot of channeled books. So this notion of being in contact with higher beings, we have much, much, much channeled literature. Many of the books we do in our classes are channeled literature, quite frankly. The Tony Stubbs's material is channeled literature. The What is Light Body is channeled literature. So the Jim Self material is channeled literature. So I think the first thing I would want to say is that the important thing would be that the channeled literature, however we would see as its source, seems to be, from a spiritual standpoint, very, very confluent. All of the books that we have studied over the years in channeled literature, and I've done a ton of them, as many of you have, I find all the channeled literature very, very confluent. It just all works together well. That's one piece. The second piece is, this is my personal feeling, is that I don't feel that we have really expanded our spirituality enough yet. And I do not feel threatened at all with any kind of change in worldview, because I think we have to change our worldview, quite frankly. I think we have to move from the limitations of third dimensional beings into a much higher fifth dimensional understanding that we are eternal soul spirits, still in a body, that we need to change the third dimensional view of life. And I think that's going to happen on the earth plane by hook or by crook. But the real most important thing is, for anyone on the spiritual path, the knowledge on the spiritual path is always going to be in concert with the energy within your own sacred heart. So that any one of us, when we are in awareness, we will know whether a message is true or false, as to whether it resonates or not with the spiritual aspect of our sacred heart. So one of the reasons why I don't have any fear is that we know if a message is going to be true, it has to resonate with what is at the center of who we are. And as long as you understand that, and please don't get worried about the periphery of where we are. Our third dimension needs to change. Our third dimension needs to change. Religions need to change. Religions are very, very far behind. We need to move into a higher spiritual realm. And I think that the non-human intelligences will help us to move into that higher realm. That's my opinion, my take on things. Does anyone else care to address this issue before we move on? We're in no hurry to finish tonight. I just want you to know that. Karen first, and then John, and then Cheryl. It looks like we're on to a hot topic.
Just a comment about not only the channeled books, but the more experiences that we have with dreams, you know, that seem so much more real, you know, like a message from other realms, message for meetings, you know, that some of us have had, contacts and signs from our loved ones who have passed. The studies we've done with the near-death experiences, it seems to me like the UAPs is all part of that too. You know, that it all goes together, and all of our studies to this point are what lead me to include UAPs as a part of just our realization of other realms, or, you know, other life, whatever, and life beyond the body and all of that.
John, would you like to respond to that first? And I'd like to respond as well. Thank you, Karen. Very important point.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, you know, again, I agree. I think that this is just a natural extension of spiritual growth. And I think that, you know, truth be told, this has been, you know, we've been leading up to this. And I think the work that Vince through Now Creations has been doing with, you know, all of us has been bringing us to this point. You know, I don't think this is necessarily the end point, but I think it's an important next step. And I couldn't agree more, Vince, with what you said. You know, all the things in the third dimension are ready for a change. And I don't know about all of you, but I sure feel like there's something on the horizon. I don't know what that is, but it does feel big, and I'm not afraid of it either. You know, I think this is a part of it. So I agree with you, Karen. I think this is a natural extension, and Vince, you know, I think you've been at the forefront of this in many ways, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are.
My thoughts are very simply that what you said, Karen, that conversations with those who have passed, our loved ones, of course, I spoke about that this morning in our service. All of these things are part of the UAP. We have to realize it's more than just UFOs and ETs and so on. There are many anomalous phenomena, and one of which is our connection with those who have passed. So I couldn't agree more with you that it is just one more anomalous phenomenon. Okay, any other comments in that direction? John and then Cheryl. John?
Yes, Karen, I was thinking the same thing, specifically dreams, because I dream a lot. And the point I want to make when Vince was talking about the just kind of scratching the surface and evolving, my dreams have changed a lot in the last 2 or 3 years with the acceleration of all the classes and the teachings. So the dreams have changed a lot, and I know it's from the escalation of our studies and also the meditations we do. So my dreams now are much more interactive, especially with one person who I was not on the best terms with, but I meet him at least once a month, if not more often. It's just really interesting. And I also have dreams now that I can't quite bring back with me, but I'm into that dream state and I see these pieces of paper with letters and numbers going across. I mean, it sounds pretty weird, but I see this kind of code and it kind of makes sense when I'm in the dream. But when I wake up in the morning, or there'll be phrases, oh, how nice these phrases are, but I can't write them down in the morning. But I feel like, I know that continuing with this path, I expect more progress in that. A better connection is what I might say. A better connection, and it's probably more on my part than it is on the part that we're meeting. So the dream state fascinates me. Dreams used to scare me. They weren't pleasant. Now they're just so different. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll go to Cheryl and then Connie, and then John will come back to you, John Shartle. Cheryl?
So this is so interesting, Karen and John Hoops. Before I knew what you were going to talk about, we all kind of simultaneously raised our hands. I had, some interesting dreams the other night around, having an experience, and the details of the dream maybe aren't that important right now. It felt like, I received some understanding about frequency, and that we're similar to what you said, Vince. We're not quite ready. We need to raise our frequency. We need to keep raising. There's something about frequency is more important than ever, is what what I hear. But as a result of these conversations that we've been having over the past few weeks, my dreams too have become richer and fuller around this topic. And John, like even John Hoops with the code, that you're kind of seeing there. I too feel like with the meditations and the increased devotion to the meditations, as we very intentionally look at this topic, that we are all going to see and hear and feel more and more. That's just what I'm sensing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Connie, then we'll come back to John Shartle. Connie?
Okay, I was watching a program on the History Channel. It was about aliens, and they were talking about a lot of the research that they've been doing with that. And it seemed to me that what they were saying was Mars was populated at some point in time, but it was destroyed because of the atomic bomb or something like that. And I wondered what your take on that was, because it sounded very much like it's a part of the plan, whatever happened.
John, I'll turn that over to you.
Thanks, Connie. Yeah, that's, there again, that's that's one of the speculations that maybe there was life on Mars and, a long time ago, and that, for whatever reason, it's not there now. And there's, I think that's part of the reason we have sent so many probes to Mars to see, what's going on, what evidence is there one way or the other that there may or may not have been life there. And I don't think there's any real consensus on that. There's a lot of speculation. There's indications, of course, that there was life on Mars. But, if something was there and gone hundreds of millions of years ago, which is the blink of an eye in cosmic time, it would be very hard to find a trace of it, so it may be that if there ever was a civilization there, it kind of came and went in a way that we will be very challenged to find it. So it's possible. Yeah, it is possible, but I don't think that there's any consensus around that yet. But if I could just address the dream issue, because I think that this is an important issue.
John, excuse me one moment. Would you mind before you do so, would you mind mentioning the Artemis program and the possibility of going to Mars? Could you just spend a little bit of time on that?
Sure. Well, the Artemis program is, and I don't know what the status of it is right now with the change of an administration and new priorities, but, when I say we, mankind last set foot on the moon in 1972. That was when the last Apollo mission left the moon. So it's been, it's been sitting there waiting for another visit for a long time. And there's much to be gained by going to the moon. There's a lot of science and discovery that could go on there. The Artemis program is the next phase of what was once the Apollo program. You all remember when they landed on the moon, and there were 6 missions that went there. Well, the Artemis mission, the Artemis program, is intended to go back to the moon and eventually start to form moon bases there. They are expected to send up their first, not to the moon, but just a crew. They're supposed to send up their first test crew in 2026. It'll be a 4-person crew. It'll be the first, when they eventually do get to the moon, it'll have a first female on board, which is exciting. But that is sort of the first step towards larger exploration of the solar system, eventually Mars. But the thing about Mars, if I can just kind of take a side note here, Mars is very interesting, and it's very close, and it's very similar to Earth. But there are lots of places in our own solar system that are probably more likely to have some form of microbial life on it than Mars, frankly. And there's a lot of, although we talk about Mars because we know Mars, it's not the only place that they're looking. There are moons of Jupiter that they're looking that have volcanic activity and oceans. And anytime you have those things, there's a good indication that there might have been the right recipe for life. So, it's funny because we talk about this in 2 different ways. We're talking about the potential of, life from somewhere else visiting us in a very highly evolved way. And yet we're still looking for these trace elements of life, out of our other, in the other direction. And they're also looking, Vince, if I could just touch on this, we've all heard about the Webb telescope. The Webb telescope is doing fantastic science out 1 million miles from our planet, looking deeper into the cosmic origin than we've ever been able to do. And it's finding unbelievable things. In fact, there's a planet called K218b, I believe it's called. And it has all the biosignatures of life. And when Kepler's looking, I'm sorry, not Kepler, when the Webb telescope is looking at it, it's certainly not seeing the actual planet. It's seeing the light signatures and the chemical signatures that are coming off of these planets that are thousands of light years away. And it's able to pick up these biosignatures, which are indicating that there may be life out there on this one particular planet. So there's lots of exciting stuff happening in that realm, even as we consider the possibility that life from somewhere else is visiting us now on sort of a grand scale. That was a long way to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you, John. And my understanding too was that there are plans, seemingly, to go to Mars in 2040.
Yes, they're very tentative plans at this point. They have to get back to the moon first. We're rusty at that, so we need to do that first and get that down, get our moon base, because the moon base will be part of a Mars expedition. It takes a lot of rocket fuel and energy and all kinds of things to get outside of Earth's atmosphere. And if you can launch a craft from the moon, which has 1/6 of the Earth's gravity, you have a better prospect, first of all, getting off of the surface and getting there in one piece. So yes, that's part of the plan.
Yeah, I thought that was important to note. John, go ahead then about your concern about dreams.
Yeah, it's interesting. Of course, Cheryl and I have talked a little bit, and dreams have really become, for me too, a very important inquiry, because I have always had a pretty rich dream life, but I find my dreams seem to have more heft to them these days, a little bit more messaging that I believe is happening. I won't go into the details, but I had a series of dreams last year, actually, in Florida, that I still revisit, and I wonder what they meant. There were 2 distinct dreams on different days that had to do with encounters with with NHI and the possibility of a large visitation. And I don't take that lightly, because I really do. I think dreams, especially for somebody like me, are a way of sort of bypassing the rational mind and getting in there and giving a message, leaving a message in a way that I'm going to pay attention to. So I would say to everybody, you know, if you've not paid much attention to your dreams, I would encourage you to do that, because I agree with everybody. These are important things. And if you have the luxury of keeping a dream journal, that's the best thing to do. When you get up in the morning, write it down, or if you can just talk it into your phone, leave a voicemail on your phone with as much detail as you can. That's a great way of, because you know how dreams are. They're ephemeral. You know, you have them, they're very powerful. And then by noon, you're going, what was that dream that I had last night? So if you can get it down right away, it will serve you well.
Thank you, John. And again, NHI, make sure now we're getting the jargon, non-human intelligence.
Yes.
Should have that down pretty well by now. Non-human intelligence, NHI. Thank you, John. Any other questions that you have? John Hoops.
A comment and then a question. The comment is the telepathy tapes that you mentioned that you were made aware of by another member at the Soul Foundation. So yesterday, we shared those telepathy tapes with our fourth person in our community. In a conversation, it came up, a autistic grandchild. And it was just immediately shared that, oh, you might be interested in these telepathy tapes. So I just wanted to share that, John.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it is. And
Wonderful.
the other thing, when I went back and listened a little bit at the beginning of the last session, I thought, John, that you said something about, I couldn't quite pick up the second word, but thought experiments or thought expressions. You said something that we might do something with thought expressions or thought experiments. I'm just wondering what that was in reference to. Does that ring a bell?
John, yes, that's just a term that I use when I want to consider something, a thought experiment. Like, let's just consider this.
I gotcha.
It's just the terminology that I use.
I gotcha.
It's a
I had
thought
my
experiment.
goggles on and was ready to go. I gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember what context I used it
Yeah.
in, but that's really what that's about.
Yeah.
It's just
Sure.
for consideration.
Thank you. That was more me than anything else.
That's okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's okay.
And finally, John, the last question I have really is, this has been such a passion of yours. I'm just wondering at a little bit of your history. Is this something that was really interesting to you as a child and maybe laid dormant and then came to surface? Or when did this really become something that you just took off and explored? And because this has happened over a period of time, but I'm just wondering about that feeling where maybe first you knew this was a route you were going to go, or how it came about.
Well, John, thank you for that question. You know, I first became interested in this topic when I was about 11 years old, and there was a book that's still around and still well known called Chariots of the Gods, written by a guy. I think he's probably in his late 80s now. A German guy, an Austrian guy by the name of Erich von Däniken. So this is 1974, maybe 75. Erich von Däniken, his inquiry was, there are all these anomalous things on the planet. How did they happen? And he goes through everything, like the pyramids, like Stonehenge, like many of the megalithic structures around the earth, that when you stop to think about it, it seems nearly impossible that they were created by human beings at a certain time in mankind's history. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. South America is covered with structures that you just can't even believe them, that they exist, that were built, thousands of years ago. And the question is, how did they get there? Now, it's a big leap, of course, to go from, well, I don't know, so I guess it was aliens, and that's not what he does. He pretty methodically takes it through. Anyway, all that to say, that book, which still holds up in many ways as a foundational book, was kind of my breakthrough. I mean, I was just fascinated by it, and it was just sort of a lifelong thing for me, where I just kind of followed it. Now, the truth of the matter is that when I when I started working for the government at the age of 25 or 26, I forget what I was, this telling people that you think that, that there are UFOs and NHIs isn't really a great career move. And I'm just being honest with you. That's just at the time, that was just, so and that's true of many things. When you work for the government, you have to sort of, have a certain level of, propriety, I guess. So, I was interested in it, but it was kind of on the down low a little bit. But to your point, the big thing for me, well, first of all, when I retired, I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted. But kind of almost at the same time, the New York Times broke the story of the three videos, December of 2016, I think it was. That's when Lou Elizondo came out. That's when Leslie Kean wrote the story in the New York Times, and this thing kind of broke open, where for the first time the United States isn't just saying that this is nonsense, which is what the storyline was for a long time. Yeah, there are things in the sky, there are things under the oceans, there are things we don't know what they are. And that wasn't, I mean, it's whatever it is, 8 years later now, but it's kind of hard to reckon like how big of an admission that was, that the United States was saying there are things in the sky, we don't know what they are. So that kind of set the template for many people who had been sort of underground about this to really come above ground and start talking about it.
John, if I recall accurately, did not your father talk to you about when Neil Armstrong was on the moon? Was that not a part of your background?
Well, kind of, Vince. When I was what was I? I guess I was 5, almost 6 years old, July of 1969. I remember my parents getting me, I don't know if I was napping or sleeping or whatever, but I was a little kid, and I think it was actually my brother got me up and brought me down and sat me in front of the television and said, "You have to watch this. You'll remember this your whole life." And it was this fuzzy thing on a black and white TV, and I didn't really know what it was, but I remember it. They were right, and it really did. It struck a chord, because I remember going out thinking, looking at the moon and going like, I can't see anybody up there. That's a little kid, of course, but yeah, that was a big thing for me.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. Any other questions, any concerns, anything you would like to bring up?
Vince, I have a question for you. If you have, I'll hold off, but I do have a question for you at some point in this conversation.
I'm not done with my questions for you, John, so I'm going to just give me a chance to tackle these are some questions I have. First of all, could you speak to Jacques Vallée talks about the invisible college. Mm-hmm. Could you address that issue of the invisible college concerning UAPs?
Sure. I think it's important, and thank you for bringing up Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée is kind of I'll say the sort of the grandfather of this conversation in the modern era. Jacques is a brilliant French scientist who, I guess the right word might be polymath. He's one of those guys that has his finger in so many different things and he does all of them well. He's a computer scientist, he's an entrepreneur, he's an investor, but he's been sort of a champion of the UAP topic since the 60s, since the early 60s. He was one of those brave souls that didn't really mind the fact that people thought he was a little nutty, you know. And so all of that to say to the Invisible College. So Jacques, back in the 60s, he's a very persuasive guy. He made contact with several different people, including J. Allen Hynek and a few other people, really smart people who really, frankly, had careers to defend. You know, that they were in a position that if they came out and they were talking about this, they could probably, you know, be subject to ridicule, maybe job implications, that sort of thing. So with that being said, the Invisible College, which I think harkens back to the Renaissance, when the science was kind of emerging and it was not really well received by the Catholic Church, which was kind of the dominant political force on Earth at the time. Scientists had to work kind of underground. They had to kind of get together underground. They had to talk underground. They had to be very careful about what they did so that they didn't, you know, get burned at the stake or something. So Jacques formed this group with a group of people very similarly for the same reasons, not necessarily being burned at the stake, but maybe being subject to ridicule, and formed this group of people who were scientists and thinkers and philosophers to get together for this very purpose, to think. It's kind of the precursor of the Soul Foundation, honestly. It's the same idea as the Soul Foundation, only the Soul Foundation is above ground. Jacques Vallée and the Invisible College were working on this sort of underground, quietly, behind the scenes, doing really important work and really important interviews and studies and philosophizing. So he's out and about now today. He's still alive and well and still doing great work. He's written many books. The pop culture reference to Jacques Vallée, though, is this. If you've ever seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I think we've all seen the Close Encounters of the Third Kind. If you recall, one of the main characters in that movie was a French scientist who was trying to get to the root of the whole of this story. That person is Jacques Vallée. I mean, that's not the name that they apply. His name is Truffaut in the movie, but that character is based 100% on Jacques Vallée. And interestingly, as well about that movie, so that character was based on Jacques Vallée. At the very end of the movie, one of his cohorts in the Invisible College, a guy by the name of J. Allen Hynek, and that's a whole other story, a very interesting story, makes a cameo appearance at the very end of the movie. When the big craft shows up over the mountain, there's a very brief scene where an older guy with a pipe walks out to see this, and that's J. Allen Hynek. So all that to say, Vince, the Invisible College is a group of guys, very smart people, big thinkers, who got together in the 60s to work on this topic without being above ground about it, to avoid ridicule, and to be able to do their work well and out of the limelight. Does that address your
Very
inquiry?
much so. Thank you. Any other questions from anyone? My next question. One of the presenters was Ryan Graves, the pilot, at the Second Soul conference. I was very curious. Do you recall anything specifically, he being one of the pilots there, was there anything specifically that he said? It would just seem to me that he's the one that had the experience that was there. From his presentation, were you moved one way or the other? Did it just have a little kind of like, here's a person that was really there? Just curious what his presentation might have been, because he was one of the pilots that was involved.
Yes. So Ryan Graves is a very important voice in this conversation today. And here's why. He is as you said, he's a pilot. He was a pilot. And he was on a number of, I'll boil this down. He was on a number of missions off of his aircraft carrier where he and his crew saw these spherical objects. They looked like spheres with cubes inside of them. And they were flying all around in their training space to the point where they thought that there was a hazard. They came back and reported it to the commanding officer that, you know, these things were up there. They didn't know what they were. They didn't know. They thought maybe, well, this is part of the training exercise. This is dangerous. And nobody knew anything about it. They were like, we don't know what they are. So Ryan Graves has made it his mission, since he's left the military, to approach this topic from a safety standpoint. In fact, he has a group, I think it's called Pilots for Safe Aerospace. It's a lobbying group. And what his angle on this is, he's very much, he's a big thinker. You know, he is a very big thinking person, but he's also a realist, and he understands that, and he'll tell you this. He mentioned this in the conference, that you can talk about UFOs all day long and non-human intelligence, and there's a large segment of the government, whether it's Congress or the executive or whomever, that are just kind of tune out on it. They're just going to be like, yeah, okay, whatever. So his thing is, nobody's going to dismiss pilot safety. So let's use that as a wedge in the door to get this topic being discussed. So it's a legitimate issue. I mean, it really is. Of course, nobody wants to have, you know, our military pilots, you know, having to take evasive action and all these kinds of things around these objects. But it's obviously a much larger topic. His position on this whole thing is, I understand it's a big topic, but the way to get people talking about it, the way to get your congressman talking about it, is from a safety standpoint. If you can say there's objects up there, I'm a pilot, I'm credible, and I've seen these things, somebody's going to pay attention, because no congressperson wants to be the one that ignored an issue that maybe put a pilot in jeopardy, or put pilots in jeopardy, or put our military in jeopardy. So, you know, it's an interesting approach to this. But anyway, that's what Ryan Graves' position is, and you know, that's what he talked about. He wants people to look at this from a safety issue. It's not just a bogus thing. It really is kind of a safety issue for for civilian pilots, for military pilots, for anybody who has, you know, who's flying in the sky. It's definitely an issue. And by the way, Ryan Graves is gigantic. I saw him walking down through the auditorium, and I was like, oh my God, I didn't think that guy was that huge. But he's just a huge guy, but and a very nice man too. But that's his position on it. That's his take on this topic.
And let me just add another piece to that. Was not that the basis for Luis Elizondo's book, Imminent, that regardless of what people may think about these things or not, the fact of the matter is they pose a danger because we don't know what they are, and they are in our airspace. Was that not the basic premise for Luis Elizondo in his work? He himself seemed to be, well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. The fact of the matter is something's going on that's threatening our defense.
Yeah, you know, Lou comes at it from a slightly different angle. You know, he was an Army guy, but yes, he has worked in collaboration with other military members, for like Ryan Graves and like David Fravor and Alex Dietrich, on the issue of, you know, our pilots being up there with things they don't know what they are. Now, you know, whether they're a threat or not, we don't know, but they're there, and you know, these things seem to be able to maneuver instantaneously. Our planes cannot maneuver instantaneously. So it may not be because one of these objects is trying to cause a problem. It may just be that they can move a lot quicker than our stuff can. And if our planes are trying to make crazy maneuvers, they put themselves in danger. Lou comes at it a little differently, because he was actually on a UFO task force. It was called ATIP. It's a government acronym, where he was looking into these things, and he saw that there's definitely something going on. And his bottom line was, he wanted to get this information up to the Secretary of Defense. And there were a million layers of people who said, no, we don't want the Secretary of Defense to know about this, because if they know, then they can't deny it. It's this thing in the government called plausible deniability, which means if you don't know about something, you can't either confirm or deny it. So, so Lou's position was, this is important. This is world-shattering information. This is really important. The Secretary of Defense should know. He was stymied from doing that. And he said, well, fine, I'm going to take a I'm going to take a principled stand. And if I can't get to see the Secretary of Defense, I'm going to leave the military and make this information public in the best way that I can.
And was it not really through someone in the Defense Department that allowed these videos to be made public?
Yeah, it was a little bit of sleight of hand that actually happened. He did a little bit of an okey doke on the structure that limits these things within the government. He worked with a guy named Christopher Mellon. Christopher Mellon used to be an Assistant Secretary of Defense, who is also on board with this topic. And once Chris Mellon was made aware that this was going on, he was irate. He's like, I'm the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and I don't know anything about this. So through some clever bureaucratic maneuvering, they got the Defense Department to sign off on these 3 videos as being non-classified. Once they were non-classified, Elizondo could then put them out, and the rest is history. But it wasn't a straight line to that happening. There was some zigzags and a little bit of a sleight of hand.
And yet, interestingly enough, were it not for those videos, the New York Times article would not have come out, which really has brought everything really much more to the fore. So I just think that's very important for us to understand these things. That, for whatever reason, Luis Elizondo, with all of the things that occurred, he got to the Christopher Mellon, they did come out, and now it's obviously a very important issue.
If I could say this, if I could just jump in there, Vince, sometimes things, I have seen those videos 1,000 times. I mean, every time there's anything related to UFOs, they show those videos. And to the point where I kind of blank out when I see them now. But it's really worth looking at them. It's really worth kind of looking at them with a fresh set of eyes. When you think of these pilots on a training mission, seeing these things, which literally, one of them literally looks like a UFO. It's called the gimbal video. And you see this thing rotating in the sky. And then what you hear the pilot say is there's a whole fleet of them. And what's important about that is Lou Elizondo and others have said that's a reference to the fact that there's probably 5 minutes of video that if you could see the whole video, you would see a whole fleet of these things, these craft that look very much like the gimbal. What the heck is that? I mean, that's really important. So I would just say, if you haven't seen it in a while, take a look at it. Look it up on YouTube. It's easy to find. It's really shocking when you look at it through fresh eyes.
Thank you, John, for that addition. Any other comments or questions anyone would like to ask? I have a couple more, John. Do you think that the Soul Foundation could work with the government?
Work with the government? Look, I think let me say this. I think it's really good. They made very smart choices in being independent from any government subsidy, because, I don't want to get into what the government knows and doesn't know, or what their motivations are, because I don't know. I have my ideas about that. I don't know. But I think if the government was able to touch the Soul Foundation in some meaningful way, their work would be tainted. Seriously tainted. Now, I think that they could be advisors. I think that they could go and, if the government, whoever the government is, people, whatever, I think that the Soul Foundation could definitely be beneficial to the government. But I don't think so right now. No.
That's what I meant, working with the government. I should have been clear. Do you think that certainly they have to maintain their independence, but the Soul Foundation, I understand, is advisory to other groups, to other governments. So I was just wondering if you thought that they might be perhaps advisory to the U.S. government.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Yes, I think they should be. In an ideal world, I think they should be. I think they're perfectly well positioned to do advisory work. Gary Nolan, who is the one of the founding members, he's everywhere talking to people who will listen to him. He's a very credentialed, a geneticist working at Stanford University. This guy has nothing to lose. He's willing to tell his story to anybody who will listen. It's kind of interesting that the government's not much interested in what he has to say. This very smart guy. So I think that there are reasons for that, though, Vince. I think that, and it's hard not to start going down into getting into layers of what one would call conspiracy theory. But, the fact of the matter is sometimes there are conspiracies. I think, the government doesn't necessarily want the information that the Soul Foundation has to provide, because to a certain extent, they know. I think that there are people in the government, I believe, who have a lot more information than even the Soul Foundation has. So, I've often wondered that. Why would they, why would they need to form these new committees? And, there are all these different groups that sprung up. Somebody knows stuff, and they should just ask that guy who knows the stuff. But, in a perfect world, yes, maybe the Soul Foundation can help the government.
Another question I do have is the notion that I've heard is said that whenever people are going to talk about UFOs specifically, you need three things. You need the evidence, crafts, the evidence. You need the beings, are there the actual ETs, and you need the encounters that people have had. So that whenever you're talking about UFOs particularly, could you address the issue that perhaps those might be the three needs? You need the evidence, the craft, or the debris from a crash, whatever it might be. You need, are there beings? And then lastly, have there been encounters of the a la, Whitley Strieber? So I'm just curious if you would see those as kind of like you need all three to perhaps move things forward.
I think we have all three of those, Vince. Honestly, I do. I think that we have, we certainly have, thousands of people who have had some kind of an encounter, and, they have very deep stories. Whitley Strieber is probably one of the most famous, but, we have Betty and Barney Hill. We have Lonnie Zamora, who was a police officer in New Mexico, who, came upon this thing that landed in the desert, and all these very anomalous experiences. These are very credible people. They're not crazy. They're not seeking fame and fortune. Nobody's getting rich off of this, so I think we have that.
Perhaps let me be a little more direct. Perhaps what we need to do is, can we get all three of these together? And will the Soul Foundation be an agency whereby the encounters will be very simple? But would the Soul Foundation, do you think, be able to coordinate crafts evidence plus ET, Gary Nolan, some kind of biology of ETs? So can we get all three together? There seem to be all three in separation, but they don't seem to be able to coordinate them all together. And I'm wondering if you would see the Soul Foundation as a group of people who might be able to get all three together.
I think they are if anybody can do it, it's them. I do believe that. And I think that's part of their initiative. They're trying to bring people together. The one piece of this being the encounters. That's the place where they've been a little hesitant with that. And as my understanding is that they're going to bring that piece of the puzzle into their next conference. So, in a practical nuts and bolts kind of place, I think they're the ones to do it. They're the people that are doing the footwork on this. They know who the craft people are. They know who the biology people are. They have the anecdotes from people who have had experiences, and I think they're looking to be the clearinghouse of all that kind of information to bring this to the fore, to bring this information to the fore and to the public in a way that it is virtually undeniable that this is the situation. Again, not explaining what it is, but that it is, just the mere fact that this is not a fabrication. Because to this point, there is still an element of, well, this is just misidentified, whatever, or people having hallucinations or whatever. It's clearly not the case. And I think that's their mission. Their mission is, or at least part of it, is to bring all that together in a substantive and undeniable sort of way. And honestly, that's kind of looping back to what I was mentioning at the beginning of this. We have a person that has kind of emerged and is on the scene right now by the name of Jake Barber. And I don't like to give anybody too much weight, because everybody can, well, I don't want to say it like that. I don't want to give everybody too much weight, but I will say this: Gary Nolan is working with Jake Barber because Jake had some physical issues as a result of his encounter. He had a spiritual encounter, but he also had physical issues that were perfectly suited for Gary Nolan in his capacity as a cancer doctor or cancer biologist to get involved with and figure out what was going on with him. So, kind of on that nuts and bolts level, Gary, who is the founder of Soul, is working in the field with real people on these topics.
Well, let me ask again, do you think that I see that point very clearly? Do you see the Soul Foundation saying, here's a piece of wreckage. This is a biological piece of an ET person.
I believe they could be the vehicle through which somebody could come forward with that information. Yes. And I think they would be, if the Soul Foundation were to do that, it would be take it to the bank time, because I think they would vet it so thoroughly. They would be, if I were going to be the person to have that piece of metal, they're the people that I would want to take it to, because I think they will be the ones to do it with the greatest integrity and scientific rigor.
Thank you. That's what I was most interested in, because my understanding is that there are people supposedly who do have material that, how it's going to be coordinated. Thank you, John, for sharing that. I think that's all I really need to ask of you, but maybe I'll ask one final question later. Does anyone else have any questions that you would like to ask? Cheryl. Mm-hmm.
John, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this connection with Gary Nolan and sort of how it started. So I think this is really interesting about like how he was in his lab, and like, as I recall, people from the government kind of showed up. So, like the government has called on him, but can you tell us that story?
Yes. So again, Gary Nolan is he has some really long medical title, immunobiologist or something. He's a really smart guy who deals with cancer, with anomalies in the brain, those kinds of things. And he actually is he's an esteemed scholar. He has a lab named after him at Stanford. So he was in his lab one day working on something, and several years ago, and he was told there are some folks from the government here to see you. Do you have some time? And so he thought, okay, sure, I'll see these folks. So these guys came in and they gave, the long story short is basically they presented him with a series of photographs and brain scans, and they said, can you tell us what's going on with these patients? And so he looked at them and basically said, these are all brains that have somehow been affected by some kind of, radiation or something like traumatic at the inner core of the brains. And so they basically said, these are scans of military folks who have had close encounters, who have gotten to, close to a UFO or to a. They didn't tell him that. They inferred that these are folks that were exposed to anomalous things. And so through a series of back and forths, he came to understand that these were folks that had been exposed to UAP. And he thought at first, when these guys showed up, that he said, when he tells the story, he's like, I was looking around, I was looking out the window, I thought somebody was pulling a prank on me, but it was true. So it was his first glimpse of the fact that this was something that could be an issue. So that kind of brought him into the topic, and he just became more and more involved in it. He was also involved, if you've ever heard of Havana syndrome, which is a whole other thing that doesn't have to do with UAP. He's been involved in understanding that too, and how the effects of what the effects of that are on the brain. And many of these brain scans look like Havana syndrome. So, anyway, Gary became very interested in this very quickly, and has been, one of the leading voices in this conversation for, several years now. But he came in it kind of, by accident almost. He was not somebody that was out there reading books about this. He wasn't 11 years old reading Chariots of the Gods. He kind of came in it from a different angle. So that's Gary's story.
And I think the Havana syndrome was the mental disorders that many people in the United States experienced when they were in Cuba, working working as agents there in Cuba or part of the government. So that's the Havana syndrome. Mm-hmm. Any other questions that anyone else has? John, you said you wanted to ask me one, but go ahead.
I do. Well, Vince, here's something I would like your take on. And I don't think in all of our conversations about this that I've asked you this question directly. Mm-hmm. Many years ago when I was in college, I studied this and then put it away for a long time. And then as I have been studying this recently, this piece of the puzzle keeps coming up. And it's for people who, people like Kelly Chase, I've referenced her before, has done a great deal of conversation about this. And that is the idea of the cave. The cave.
What? The cave?
The cave. Plato's cave.
Sure.
Yeah. So the idea that, right now we're in this reality that we think is our reality, but in fact, it's not our reality. And, she has done a great deal of discussion about this, and it's gotten me thinking about it. And she has also brought into the conversation one of her friends. He's a professor of, James Madden is his name. He's a professor of philosophy at Benedictine University, and they've done a lot of talk about this. And I wonder, I could attempt to address it, but I wonder if you think that it's relevant, and if you could explain it perhaps better than I can.
About the cave?
Yes, the cave. In that we are in a cave moment, in that we think we're having, we think we're in this reality, but in fact, reality is so much bigger.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, it was pretty much what I was saying in my response initially about spirituality. But Plato's cave, in a nutshell, if there's a group of people and what they really see reflecting on a wall while we're in the cave are just shadows of reality. And the people behind them, which there's a big fire, are simply carrying things, and they see shadows of reality. So you have two problems. First of all, the people in the cave are just seeing the shadows. But the second problem really is that the people behind them are carrying things of the world that are causing the shadows. And then you have someone who breaks free. One of the prisoners breaks free, and he gets out of the cave, and he goes into the sunlight. And at first, the sunlight is too much for him. It just takes over his eyes. And then eventually, his eyes begin to settle, and he begins to see that it's a whole nother world. than what people in the cave have thought. That other world is not just seeing shadows, but even seeing something material things, which are not the real world. So the guy comes down from the cave, comes out from outside of the cave down to his fellow members, says, "You ought to see what I see. You should see what's going on." And of course, what they simply said was, "Get out of here. Get out of here. Don't bother me." So it's the same problem of credibility. It's the same problem of credibility, where the vast majority of people are content to either see shadows or even things that are causing shadows, but they're very third dimensional. And we need to get out of the third dimension, not by way of leaving the world, but we need to move into a higher spiritual dimension from which we can then bring a higher energy to then, my feeling, is to raise, going back to Cheryl's dream, the frequency of what we're doing here on the planet. So right now, we need to get beyond the third dimension, simply your physicality and the material world. So rising out of the cave would be moving beyond simply your limited human personality. Have you not heard that recently? Mm-hmm. For the last 15 years, getting beyond your human personality, getting beyond simply what's affecting you materialistically, and start to move into your inner core, your soul spirit, and to educate your soul into higher spiritual energies that would then in turn raise the quality not only of your physical bodies, but of the material world itself. I hope that was a good explanation of what the cave was about. The people who are doing this, of course, you have a lot of the people. You have Socrates that started off. You have someone like, Abraham Lincoln, Dr. Martin Luther King, many people who would have a different vision. Unfortunately, they were ostracized or put to death. The good news now is we have more people that have a larger vision, and we're able to support each other in the larger visions, although still a minority, still a vast minority. And of course, we have many people who are still bound by not only their bodies and the material world, but they're especially bound by the lower energies of fear, anxiety, worry, especially fear. There's a lot of fear that is being projected by fear mongers that have a very, very low energy. All meant to be because, well, it is what it is. But I think we will make it something quite good in the long run. But you have to allow the freedom of people. You have to allow the freedom of people to be expressed. And we're now in the throes of people expressing their freedom with contrary views of simply the lower third and a higher possibility of the fifth dimension. So that would be my response. Is that adequate, John, or does anyone else care to add to that?
Yeah, yes, you said it much better than I could have ever tried to address it. It's just this, for me, it's the idea of sort of living with this in this shadow world and thinking that is the world. And then suddenly having something force you to realize that, no, that's not the world. That's just a projection of the world. The world is something else. And that's, I've just reflected on that a lot. And it feels like for me, that's, with this and many other things, that is what's happening. It's sort of this greater understanding, or at least an openness to a greater understanding.
It's a great book. It's a great little section, The Cave and the Republic by Plato. Mm-hmm. Are there any other comments that anyone would like to mention?
can I call back to John Hoops real quick, John?
Sure.
Vince?
Mhm.
John, I wanted to just make you aware of something. You know, your dream about writing stuff down is very interesting to me. There's a pretty interesting story that happened, and this was an event that happened in England in 1980, right around Christmas of 1980. It's a pretty well documented case called the Rendlesham Forest case, and this too happened at a military base, a military base with nuclear capabilities. It's very interesting that a lot of this stuff happens around military bases with nuclear capabilities. I don't know the connection, but I think there is one. So the reason I mention this is that this is, you know, it's been said that if this event happened today, it would effectively be disclosure because it was such a significant event. But one of the pieces of the puzzle is that there was a team that went out into the forest adjacent to this military base because there were reports of a crash or something that happened in the forest. There were lights, there was something happening. So they sent a security team out to look at what was going on. And one of the guys that went out was a guy named Jim Peniston. And he and his team actually found this craft in the middle of the forest. And it was just sitting there. It was this little triangular thing sitting in the middle of the forest. And, you know, he didn't have any context for what he was, you know, looking at. And so he walked up to this thing and he touched it. And when he touched it, he got this download of code. It was like these symbols and number. It was actually binary code. It wasn't symbols. It was binary code that he remembered. It was like a download. It wasn't like he saw it and then it faded away. And then, so anyway, he afterwards went and wrote the code down. And there's actually a message that goes with that. It's a very sort of cryptic message, you know, but he actually had that same sort of like seeing like a code. And it just made me think of that when you mentioned that in your dream. But if, you know, again, it's on YouTube. If you want to look him up, it's an interesting story.
What's his last name again, John?
His name is Jim Peniston, Penniston.
One more time. Sorry.
That's okay. It's Penniston.
Thank you.
And the event is called the Rendlesham, Rendlesham.
Slower. Sorry.
Okay. Rendlesham Forest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of video clips about it, and and interviews with him. So it's an interesting story.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Did he give a message, John? John Shartle.
I'm sorry?
John Shartle, did he give a message? Did he give a translation of the code?
He did get a message. I don't have it in front of me, but it's not a very long message, but it's something about visiting. It's something about trying to connect.
Very good. Thank you. I think we're pretty much at the end of our program here this evening, and I think this will be, excuse me, Marianne, looks like you have a comment. Marianne, go ahead, please.
The message they got from that said something like, for the advancement of humankind.
Yes.
Thank you. That's very
It
nice.
was a binary. They'd sent it to scientists that were they could do the, what do you call it, binary code. And
right.
They translated it, and that's what they got.
Thank you, Marianne. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. And again, I do want to say my email is up in the chat box. If anybody wants information, I'd be happy to send that off to you.
Well, let me take this opportunity, first of all, to thank all of you for your weeks of being together. This is exactly what we need to do on a regular basis. we need to be updated in areas that we know a little bit about, but we need a bigger picture. So I'm very thankful for all of you coming together with your questions and just really the energy that provided this opportunity for us. Needless to say, John, so very thankful to you for the information you brought to us. I couldn't think of anyone doing a better job than you in presenting this, not just because of being a Now Creations, but someone with a good background knowledge has been so very helpful for all of us. So we're very, very thankful to you, John, and perhaps maybe you'll go to the third Soul Foundation for us.
Yeah.
We'll see if that'll work itself out, how that might work out. Let me
Thank you.
again,
Thank you for the opportunity, Vince.
absolutely, absolutely. And let me again just tell the viewing audience that we need to educate ourselves in this area, and we'll continue to do all that we can in Now Creations to do so. If any of you are interested in involving yourself in the Cosmic Citizens Committee, please give John a call, give him or email him, whatever. Thank you, everyone. I am an eternal being of light and love. Thus, only good can come to me, and only good can come from me. And we are eternal beings of light and love. Thus, only good can come to us, and only good can come from us. Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you.